to say that is aggregate expenditure at a point in time. And to give you an analogy, imagine you have a flow in a river where there's a pump at a particular point in the river that's either injecting water into the river from elsewhere or pumping water out of the river. And this was happening in the floods in northern England earlier this year. Now, if you're going to measure that, then what you're measuring is the flow in water in the river itself, which is effectively GDP in dollars per year in this analogy, and the water being pumped in or pumped out, which is credit in dollars per year in this analogy. Now that means you can add GDP and change in debt, change in private debt, which is credit, to measure aggregate expenditure. And you can do that. The peak of the two, GDP plus credit, identifies every economic crisis since Japan. This is starting with Japanese data because we have had 25 years of warning of the situation we're now in. So the red line here is Japan's GDP in billions of yen per year. The blue line is GDP plus change in debt, credit. And you can see that since the crisis began, demand in Japan has never returned to the level it reached in 1990. And the black line shows the percentage GDP credit, change in debt, as a percentage of GDP on the right-hand axis. That peak level, just before the crisis, was at 27% of GDP. That's the scale that credit was at. It then declined to zero, and from 1998 on has been normally negative. So if you look at the credit, which is change in private debt, look at the average of that 5 years before the crisis. In Japan, it was 18% of GDP. Since the crisis, it's been minus 1.8%. And given that credit in Japan is mainly devoted to corporate expenditure, this is why Japanese corporations have lost the race with American corporations in innovation in the last quarter century. This is the USA. Not as extreme a level of credit, 15% of GDP versus 27% at the peak, but the same basic story. The peak level of GDP plus credit identified the start of the crisis, and a period of deleveraging, so credit was actually negative, is what led to the depth of the downturn. Now the recovery, such as it is, has occurred because GDP credit is now positive, but you can see it's starting to trend down once more. They're repeating the same pattern that Japan has had of rising and falling credit, with the average debt ratio remaining relatively constant. And so before the crisis, the average level of credit was 11% of GDP. Since the crisis, 3.7%. That's why there's stagnation. Now, when you take a look at a range of countries which all went through the crisis in 2008 and thereabouts, they all had incredibly high levels of private debt, which then fell after the crisis. So the United States, I've put in bold here, you can see it more clearly, the red line, rising to a peak shortly afterwards the crisis, and then flattening, and now running fairly horizontal. Japan, same story, flatlining at about 170% of GDP. Spain still plunging, courtesy of the euro and austerity. But if you go through each of these countries, you'll find a peak level of debt and then a decline in debt after that. So America peaking at 169%, now being 150, UK 197, now 160, and so on. There are some strange ones here as well. I'll be talking a bit about Netherlands. Netherlands only just passed its peak in debt just last year. Now, when you then take a look at credit, which is change in that debt, you find the same general phenomenon I'm identifying beforehand. I was checking how I'm going on time here. Before the crisis, substantial levels of credit growth. After the crisis, low or negative. And one strange one, I'm calling the Netherlands Schrödinger's zombie. I'm calling all these the walking dead of debt. But in a weird way, the Netherlands seems to be both alive and dead at the same time. It's actually had an increase in its credit. So it's